Okay, folks, we want to get underway here. So, first of all, I'm Eamon Deeney, Director of Comms in Queen's University. Tonight's part of the GFA 25 events, which you've all have seen over the last 2 or 3 days. I just want to thank a few people. I want to thank Derek Henderson, who without him, I wouldn't have managed to track a whole lot of you down. He's unbelievable. He's got you all in his eyes. I want to thank the people from Queen's who helped me get this organised, the comms team, and to get all the ticketing and stuff sorted out as well. And I want to thank Northern Ireland Screen, BBC and UTV, who are responsible for the short film that you're about to see. Their names will be on at the end. There'll be one name on it. You'll go, what is he on it for? Don't worry, I didn't put my name on there, so they did. I'm denying any responsibility. I especially want to mention 2 people here tonight who made a big effort to be here. First of all, we've got Stephen Grimison, who most of you will know. Stephen has been a good friend of mine. He was my boss for a while, and a very good boss, a brilliant journalist, and a fantastic spin doctor who learned off Mr. Campbell, no doubt, as well. And he's made a big effort to be here tonight. And I especially want to mention Ken Reid, who contacted me on Friday. He contacted me on Friday and said he wasn't going to be able to make it. He heard George Mitchell speaking on Monday, and he was so inspired, he rang me and said, I'm going to get out of hospital for 2 hours to be with you tonight. So I think that's really special. So I'm going to let you watch the short film and then hand over to Tara and William. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming.
They rolled out the red carpet at Stormont today, not because there was an agreement, but rather in anticipation of the world's media arriving en masse next week.
Anita McVeigh, Newsline.
Tara Mills.
Chris Capper. Shane Harrison.
Aggie Taggart.
Maureen Erskine.
Jean Lockery.
This is Ken Reid for UTV Live at Stormont.
Letitia Fitzpatrick for UTV Live.
Niall Donnelly.
Sharon Hall for UTV Live at Stormont.
You must remember, this is the most exciting period. There's been 2 years here with absolutely nothing happening. At least we think we're going to get a result one way or the other on Thursday night.
With 3 days to go to the talks deadline, the eyes of the world are focusing more and more on Stormont. And as the media presence outside castle buildings grows, those inside are living out Senator Mitchell's promise that they'd just eat, sleep and negotiate.
I started a poll, a serious poll, of all the journalists and media people who've arrived here. And at the moment we have 51 people say yes, 21 people say no. It's been running approximately 2 to 1 in favour of an agreement.
I feel the hand of history upon our shoulder in respect of this. I really do. And I just think we need to acknowledge that and respond to it. Now, maybe it's impossible to find a way through. Maybe even with the best faith in the world, you can't do it. But it's right to try.
These are the last hours of a political process that took years to put in place and which has been running for 22 months. Today has been a microcosm of that entire period, with reports of hope, optimism, then stalemate, even failure, and then back to breakthrough. No one yet knows if it'll be deal or deadlock.
Midnight deadline came and went, and still no sign of a deal. Well into Good Friday morning, and as the snow fell outside castle buildings, the talking and the negotiations continued inside.
So the fine-tooth combs are out in force at Stormont. Let's go straight over to there, and our political editor, Stephen Grimison. Stephen, anything new in the last 20 minutes?
Well, this is it. This is the
agreement.
agreement.
You have it in your hand.
I have it in my hand. 67 pages.
And now, with only days until the referendum takes place,
Voters across the country must get to grips with this booklet, a 30-page document laying out the Good Friday Agreement in simple terms.
Simple terms? Simple terms, my arse.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the QFTV, everybody. Do me a favor. Would you stand up where you are if you saw yourself in that film? Just stand up in the room. Anybody who saw their face anywhere in the film, stand up. You can put your hand up, Ken. We're not going to force it. Fantastic. We've got some of the big stars of that era with us here. Thank you very much. Good to see you, Corky. I think we've got about 160 people here, haven't we? You've just been reading the news. And you dashed down to do this. Yeah. I'm delighted to be standing here with a 10-year-old picture on the wall.
You and me both.
Yeah, I know. No, you're looking just the same. And there's a police cordon, as you can see outside, because they were told 160 journalists and free alcohol would be in this room. So that's what we are. Why don't you tell us what we're going to be doing?
Well, we've got 4 panels between now and 9:30. And the one thing I would say right at the outset, we have people up on the panel, on each panel across the evening, but we want to get so much more than that. We want to get all the kind of responses from the floor. So after we've done a little bit of Q&A with our panellists, we'll be opening it out. We've got roving mics and people that we really want to hear from. This is such an unusual opportunity. I can't think of anything that I've ever been to.
With the panel could be the audience. The audience could be the panel. So this is fantastic. Please expect a conversation. So don't just sit there as the audience as we go. Town hall type of format. So we're not trying to be a kind of polished TV show or anything. We want you to kind of like relax, take your jacket off, whatever. Put your hand up when you want to join in or signal in some other way, and we'll make sure your voice joins the conversation. Over to you, Tara.
Okay, well, where better to start than with Mr. Stephen Grimison. Stephen, we just wanted to start by asking you about the scoop of probably the century that you got that early morning. Tell us a little bit about how that came about.
I was minding my own business and these guys just came and gave it to me.
Yeah.
It was because there were so many people there. There were about at any one point there were about 300 journalists from all over the world, plus all the technical staff, plus politicians milling around. So it's kind of easy to hide in plain sight. So I had been hoping for a particular brown envelope, and it appeared. And the rest, as they say, is history. Because it wasn't just, it occurred to me, I wasn't just breaking a story that actually, it was pretty historic in its way, and I could actually have been holding the future of this place in my hand. I mean, my journalistic colleagues reacted in the way that I thought they would, effing and blinding. But, for instance, Ken and I have been rivals, but friends for 40 years. We go back to the newsletter and the Sunday news with each other. But not everybody reacts that way, and there was a gentleman currently in the audience who when his news desk rang him to ask him, look, Derek, we're hearing this. Look, Derek, we hear that the BBC's got this big story. They're running it everywhere. News 24's just started. It's their first big exclusive. Right, can you get us something immediately? Quote, don't believe a word of it. It's all speculation, and there'll be a press conference later anyway, so you don't need to pay any attention to that. And it'd probably surprise him to know that when I got the brown envelope, it wasn't actually meant for me. They said, have you seen Derek Henderson? I said, no, but I know where he is. Would you give him that? I said, yes, I will.
I mean, we'll come on to this as the night progresses. You can see him in the bar afterwards. But was there a sense of, I mean, obviously you must have been pretty sure of your source. You must have been pretty sure that was the actual deal. But was there any sense that you could scupper things, that there was a kind of wider responsibility on you at that point?
Well, there had been earlier in the week this comment from George Mitchell saying, look, this shouldn't be leaked, and he was aiming it at the politicians, but he also said it to us, that lives and deaths could be at risks here, I think was the exact quote. And there was a little conversation was had between me and the senior BBC management at one point about it. But as I said to them, look, people only leak things from negotiations if they're not happy. And suppose I just say, oh, that would be unfair, I couldn't run that. They give it to somebody else. So, I think that you can't say at any point that the media here had any agenda. We were all genuinely just trying to find out what the heck was going on. No one had an agenda to wreck it or build it up or anything else. We were just all trying to see what was going on. I think I think the media in general terms did a good job at that point. And I have to say, I was never pressured particularly by any party or people to push a particular thing. There was the usual briefing, of course, that goes on, but it was, given what has happened since to media relations between media and government, media and parties, it was really a bit of a Sunday school party compared to what it is now.
Yeah. Thank you, Stephen. Really appreciate that. You're going to come on to the second panel this evening, and we'll talk lots more about how you turned poacher, turned gamekeeper eventually in your career as well. But we'll talk about that. But for now, thank you for bringing that scoop to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thanks, Tara. And let's welcome our first group to the stage. We have a panel of government spin doctors from the era. Yes, and you know them all. At the far side there is Alistair Campbell, who was head of communications, government head of communications with Tony Blair. We have Joe Lennon here, his counterpart with the Irish government, and Tom Kelly, who made that journey as Stephen did from political editor and then head of news in BBC Northern Ireland into head of communications for the Northern Ireland office. Shall we welcome them to the stage? Alistair, I've got to ask first of all, the hand of history. Did you write that?
No.
What's the story behind that?
I mean, it is just incredible. We arrived at Hillsborough. I think George Mitchell had tabled the paper. We were waiting for David Trimble, I think was going to be the first meeting. Quite a lot of media hanging around. Not that many, actually, but a few media hanging out of the gates and all saying, kind of give us something. So I said to Tony, look, it's quite a big deal, this. Just do a little kind of holding. We don't need to say anything. It's just like you're here and you're hopeful and, the stuff you can do kind of falling off a log. And so, and then he goes out and does it, and he's standing where you saw him standing. Jonathan Powell and I were about 5-10 yards away. And he comes out with that stuff. And we looked at each other and said, what the hell? Because we'd sort of said, don't play it up, play it kind of very, very straight. Now, to be fair to Tony, we've Rory Stewart and I interviewed him yesterday for our podcast, just focusing on 25 years ago. And as he left, I wish to God they'd kept the microphones running. As he left, I said, the Hand of History's got its own Wikipedia page now, which is true, by the way. And he said, God, it was naff, wasn't it? So, at least he knew. He did know it was naff, but yeah, so that was it. No, it was not me.
Let me ask you all, from your perspective, what you were doing at that point in various parts of government communications. You had to work with the journalists here, also the journalists in the south and across the Irish Sea, and the international journalists coming in as well. Thinking first of all of the journalists from here in the weeks, the months, indeed the years of the talks leading up to this key moment. What was the relationship like? What was Tom, you moved over I moved over to the dark side, 1998?
I moved over literally 3 weeks before.
Just 3 weeks?
Before the agreement. So I barely knew Alistair. I barely knew my way around the place. So it was quite a probation period.
What about you, Joe?
Well, Bertie had only been elected in the summer before the Good Friday Agreement. So, I mean, I was getting to know very rapidly, baptism of fire, getting to know him, because I hadn't actually worked, people thought I had worked with him before, I hadn't. I'd been a press officer in various government departments, and the funny thing, I always thought of myself as a hybrid, because some of the civil servants thought I was a political appointment, and a lot of people outside thought I was a civil servant, and as it turns out I was kind of a mixture of the two. I was. But anyway, so we only had intensively the 6 months beforehand. In fact, even myself and Alistair wouldn't have had initially that much, a bit of contact, all right, and then intensively in Downing Street, as I recall it most, and then in Hillsborough, which gave us a false sort of sense of what things might be like when we were confronted with castle buildings. And unbelievably, I hear it's still standing. And somebody described it during the week very well, as when you walked in, you got that smell of stale body odour and stale sandwiches, and practically everything else about the place was stale as well, including some of the discussions, until basically till the two prime ministers realised, we were after a warning from Senator Mitchell that this thing was at death's door and they needed to inject a bit of life in it. And after a false start with the document that was produced and quickly not torn up, but I won't even say shredded, but anyway, put to one side. Yeah, we got going. But I felt sorry for the people outside, a lot of the people in the room, as they put their hands up earlier, because we were there, and as I recall it, talking about mood music was about as much as we could tell them. Like, most of the time it was what you couldn't tell them. Like, and you were in at meetings watching people, you know, get very excitable and not quite come to blows, but, you know, and then you were being asked what's going on. And it was at times hard to judge what was actually going on, because some would exit one door, they seemed to be okay, but within an hour you were hearing back, either directly or through from the Prime Minister's office, that they weren't happy. So
I've got to say, I've said this before, so I'm not just saying this because I'm here and you guys are in the room. I've written this and I've said it many, many times. I had various points, as these two guys know very, very well, pretty difficult relations with quite a lot of journalists. I have to say that one of the reasons why I enjoyed the Good Friday Agreement process and what followed so much was because, almost without exception, most of the journalists that you were dealing with, even though they were all trying to, you know, catch you out and they were trying to get you to tell them things that they shouldn't be, and doing all the stuff that journalists do, I always sensed they were coming from the perspective of actually wanting this to be a success. Whereas what you're very used to in the jobs that we were doing is journalists really want you to fail, and they're trying to slant the story in that direction. And I felt that very, very strongly. In fact, I was just reminded earlier, the one person who comes to mind as being in that tent outside the whole time, hoping that the whole thing was going to go tits up, was the guy with blonde hair who worked for the Daily Telegraph, who was absolutely... And I have to say, if he turns up tomorrow night, I've got no desire to be in Hillsborough tomorrow night, but I'm kind of thinking I might have to review that. But the vast bulk, and not just from here, the vast, but those guys, and it was like kind of, you said 300. It was like they were just growing hour by hour and day by day, and suddenly you started, you know, does anybody around here speak Spanish? Because we've got this Spanish TV outside, all this sort of stuff. But they all wanted it to succeed. And I think that was why, from our perspective, it was actually lots of stuff going on that was very, very difficult, but actually that made the job a lot easier.
Tom?
Yes, I think I was actually a bit surprised by the poll on the video, which was 2-1 thought it would be yes. Because a week before, there was a poll carried out in the public, and 83% said they thought it would fail in the time frame. Only 17% of the public thought it would succeed. And I think that's because the public were, after 25 years of political failure, were sort of politics weary.
Yeah.
They thought they were fatalistic. And to some extent, the same is true now. Fatalism was the biggest hurdle we faced. the belief that it can only end in failure. And of course, 25 years before we'd had Sunningdale, and that, all right, we'd got agreement, but that hadn't withstood the test of time. So that was the biggest hurdle. So that sort of sense of momentum was what the talks gave us, and that sense of, I do agree with the sense of the longer it went on, the actually more difficult it became to fail, because the bar kept getting higher, and people didn't want to be the first ones to go out and say it failed. And that's maybe what pushed them to the decisive point.
There was a point at which, I honestly cannot remember when it was, but it wasn't that long before the end, where we sat down and wrote a briefing note based upon this is not going to work, and how were we going to explain that, given there was so much invested in the idea of success. And, that was probably about 12 hours before the whole thing ended. So, this idea that it was all moving in the right direction the whole time, and right to the very end, it felt like it might, just go. So there was always, it never felt until the end, maybe this is because I'm a bit more pessimistic, Tony was always, I think, pretty confident, but I felt the whole way through until the very end, it actually wasn't going to get over the line.
And hence the mad scramble to have the plenary session. Which actually arose out of Dennis Murray saying you can't all just disappear. You have to have some event. And that meant...
We were really desperate to get away, I've got to tell you.
He wanted to go on holiday. But that meant getting the broadcasting cables in. That meant deciding when was the good moment to say we're going to take the broadcasting wires in, because that was a signal something was going to happen. And that was that was the decisive point, if you like. So we owe the broadcasters a lot, for once.
Well, not that
much. Policy work in government always goes hand in hand with communications. So the comms work, I assume, was going on alongside the negotiations. In terms of the document, Alistair, were you looking at negotiation drafts and documents, and also bringing a comms head to that?
I suppose so. Yeah. I mean, I don't think you ever kind of switch off from that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's why partly why I would be there, was because you're always thinking about how you're going to project this, and it's very interesting what Joe said there. He's absolutely right. We would feel often the pressure, particularly, it's different now because you've got 24/7 news and social media and all that. But then you still had fairly old-fashioned deadlines that people were trying to operate to. And so we knew the rhythm to the most journalist day, and we were kind of conscious of that. So you'd go out and try and kind of move the narrative on. And often, to be absolutely honest, there was nothing to say other than if we did tell the truth, it'd be a bit of a disaster. So you'd go out and just try to keep this narrative moving in the direction. And I remember when I wrote a book about when I did my Irish diaries, and Bertie came to the launch in Dublin, and he said a few words. And he actually said something which I think you might have been there, Joe, and he said that there were times when what Joe and I were just sort of deciding to go and brief between us, and I don't know how to say this without admitting that sometimes you have to be a bit economical with the truth. I think he said, even though it had very little connection with what was actually going on, but you just you're trying to avoid a vacuum, because vacuums are very, very dangerous in these situations. And the other point, which, in fact, this is the point that Joe made to me ages ago when we were talking about this. I do honestly think there's a really interesting analysis to be made about whether if social media had been around, whether we'd have done it. I think it's a very, very interesting academic question, that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Maybe this is a discussion later, but I can't conceive of being able to manage to do what we did back then in the current era. It's too easy to disrupt. There are too many bad actors out there who have access to a platform provided to them by a gentleman called Musk at the moment, and it's just incredible. And journalists, more than most, in terms of obviously the majority, I would say, of professions, it's journalists who are on it and using it largely. But it would be you could not control a narrative, I think, in that scenario. And the problem with that is then, as I say, for those, we were locked, I mean, literally almost locked into those buildings for the few days, and particularly for the last 2 days, trying to put together very difficult discussions. But the key to it all was people and relationships. And it's funny, I mean, watching what goes on, and I had a look in the last few days, just at some notes I had about discussions, and it was fascinating because there was the relationship, first of all, between Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern. And, you know, that was, for me, that was the fulcrum around which everything else happened. But the SDLP, I mean, John Hume and David Trimble had built up an understanding, and Seamus Mallon as well. And it was that relationship was very strong. You had then other people like, you know, Gary McMichael, David Irvin, who were, if you like, new to the party in terms of the discussions, but who very quickly settled into a kind of a groove, if I can call it that. But people trusted. That was the key thing, because they kind of knew it became a thing where this has to work. And you know, what Tom said earlier about like going to alert the media that we were obviously something was happening. I mean, that could have been a negative either, but the point was, back then, as I recall it, I had good relationships with journalists by and large, people I could trust, and there were times when you couldn't tell them the whole story, but you could give them a hint about what was going on. And you know, I don't know what happens these days. I honestly can't fathom how anybody doing the job I had to do back then could do it now. But and I don't know, I can't speak whether those relationships exist still, but certainly back then they were strong and worked, you know, for the people concerned. So,
can I ask you all, I'm going to bring the audience in a second, what was the most challenging, the most difficult, the toughest part of your job during this time? Alistair or Tom?
Tom, when you go.
Well, for me, it was the Monday after the agreement, because that's when we had to start planning for the referendum. And we knew that that referendum was going to be very, very tough, because we knew the DUP was going to be full-on opposed. And it was really only in the cool light of dawn on Monday morning that you began to absorb, and this may seem a strange thing to say, the full implications of the agreement for something like prisoner releases. And you knew that was going to be a battleground. So again, going back to what I said earlier, with, you know, the history of Sunningdale, for me, that was sort of the, oops, we've got a referendum campaign to win.
I thought the most difficult stuff was keeping the balance and the equilibrium of the reality inside matching the narrative outside. And what I mean by that is that a lot of the time you'd have, and I think Joe's right, that Tony and Bertie was the kind of the fulcrum, as you put it. And then you had all these other people who at certain times were intensely important to what was actually happening within the centre of it. And so let's say, for the sake of argument, it's Sinn Féin at that moment. And that's where all the kind of action is going around. Then you've got all these people wandering around the building and bumping into each other and having little conversations and what have you. And a lot of them are just watching the telly. Or they're talking to you guys or whatever. And it was keeping... And we eventually organised a sort of architecture around the building where we stopped... If we were having a meeting, say, with the unionists, and we were made sure that if Sinn Féin were coming in next, that we get them in a different way, in case they picked up on the mood of the other lot going out, because that could then affect their mood coming in. And it was kind of, it's that sort of recalibration of mood, I think, was what we found hardest. And the other thing was, they would literally come and knock on your door and complain about, I had one of the scariest moments of my life when 4 guys who are very well known came and knocked on the door and demanded some clarification. Of a briefing that I just done. If I tell you that Ferris was one of them, and so it was, you know, it was getting that balance right.
Yeah, no, I agree. But I think the hardest part was, as Tom said, was that the following week realising now what we had to do was sell this because the referendum, and in fact, I only noticed yesterday in Note I had, the date for the referendum was discussed back in February. So we had a meeting in Downing Street. So we obviously were aware that, it's funny, my memory was, I had forgotten that, but we were aware this, once the button got pressed, if it happened, which it did, thankfully. But it was, I mean, Adams has described it as the beginning of a process, not the end of one. And it was both, I suppose. And the fact that it came together so quickly in the end meant people, they were getting them into that plenary so they couldn't think too long about it and say yes. But after that, that's when, and really being honest, that's when you guys had to start working too, because trying to get it across in that short time frame for the referendum was difficult. And I mean, I know, I was talking to Stephen earlier briefly, you mentioned about Articles 2 and 3, which people kind of forgot about up here because there was so much else. But down, it was a big deal for Bertie because even within his own party, I remember being at a Fianna Fáil gig in Cavan with him, and he was getting grief over this, even though he was saying, look, it doesn't come into force unless the whole agreement does. And the Brits, excusing your presence, the Brits have given up their claim on territory as well, but...
You mean your friends and partners?
Indeed. And so they weren't, it was the audience, Alistair. So so it was, as I say, it was funny, because even, otherwise it was about, yes for peace. I even found this was the leaflet, and I'm there thinking these days, would we even produce one of these?
It looks like he's signing a condolences book there.
Yeah. Well, that's because he was wearing the black tie because he come from his mother's funeral.
I forgot.
But and you're not the first to say that, by the way. But
it looks like a treatment leaflet from the NHS.
Yeah. Oh no,
it's a care home, isn't it?
Anyway, all done a rush.
Can I jump? I hate to do this, but as Eamon has known from the very, very start, I'm actually meant to be at another place. I've got, and so I just want to. I'm really glad I've come, but these guys are going to take your Q&A, and I just want to say a couple of words to you guys as well. When I talked about I know what's going on, and I just think, I wish you all the best, because I know you've got a lot going on, and particularly you, Ken, because Everton could be going down just as we're coming up, which is very, very difficult. But no, I mean that. And so that's my Ken, Stephen, all of you. It was a pretty amazing experience. I'm absolutely thrilled that I was part of it, and I hope that we're back. No, I don't want to be here 25 years from now, but I hope the institutions are up and running within 25 years. I'll say that.
Alistair Campbell. Thank you, Alistair. We're going to come to you now anyway. Let's get a mic. Shall we get a mic? We'll just take a few minutes. Anybody got a question, a comment, a memory? I'm not limiting you in any way. Across the room.
Just before we do that.
Don't all rush, by the way.
Indeed. Seeing as he mentioned, obviously, Ken, and can I mention somebody who's not here, who I think might have been here tonight, if he could be? And his name is Charlie Bird. And Charlie and I had this... I don't know how you could describe it. Apart from the normal day-to-day run of whatever news items, and if Charlie was doing the story, you knew it was going to lead the news, and so you had to be extra careful about what you were going to say and how you were dealing with it. But then there was this other thing where Charlie would ring you from the car park of the Fairways Hotel in Dundalk, a place I was familiar with because I'm originally from Dundalk myself. And he'd be saying, they haven't turned up, or they have, and he was expecting to have a statement from the IRA. And I mean, this all started back before my time with Canary Wharf, where he was the one they picked to tell them the bad news. And right up until 2005, when he was dragged off up here to Belfast, I think, to be told about the fact that they finally announced they were dumping arms, to use the phrase that had been used by the IRA back after the Civil War 100 years ago. So it was, just to say, look, he needs to take a bit of credit for all the risks he took doing that through that period. Thank you.
Great. Anyone? Down here, thank you very much. I can't really see beyond the first couple of rows anyway. Tell us your name, if you would, once we get to you. And maybe even if you're connected to the story, tell us a bit. Go ahead.
Hello, Deglán de Bredon. I was covering it for the Irish Times. I even wrote a short book of 448 pages about it. And I enjoyed Alistair's reminiscence. I remember Alistair at one point, I asked him, what happens now? And he's looked at me and said, what happens now is what's happening now. But the night of that was a crazy night.
It's sort of Buddhism, that really, isn't it?
Yes, very philosophical.
Very good.
The power sharing announcement was the deal between the SDLP and the UUP was announced. We were called out to, a few of us anyway, were called out in the rain to get the announcement, and I think it was Conal McDevitt and Seamus Mallon, and we told us about it, and we all shook hands. The journalists shook hands with one another. I remember shaking hands with Frank Miller, Irish Times colleague and former senior official in the Ulster Unionist Party, and I think one of my colleagues had tears in his eyes. But that was a big moment. But that was quite early, and that was really only one stage. And so anyway, there was a bit of socialisation going on. I remember drinking whiskey with Mary Holland, Niall McCafferty and Danny Morrison. Quite a varied collection.
We should film that. That would have been great.
And the North-South bodies were a big topic in the negotiations, even though they didn't get much of a show in the actual deal. And I actually composed what might sound like a politically incorrect song nowadays, which was, if I said you were a cross-border body, would you hold it against me? And then...
I think you just got cancelled there, Declan. But,
and then Michael Fisher, who's here, found a bunk for me in the RTE caravan. And then at 6, we were called... I remember some of my colleagues were sleeping literally on the floor in the luxurious press building. And then we were called... John Alderdice was doing a press conference, and I still remember the look of absolute disbelief on his face that the deal had been done or was about to be done. And then in due course, Bridge Rogers, we saw Bridge Rogers giving Seamus Mallon a hug. And Bridge Rogers now lives near me. She lives in Howth. And every time I meet her, I ask her for the Mallon hug, and she gives me a Mallon hug, which is a great privilege and very good for media, political relations. And
no, don't give us all of this book that you've written.
So anyway, and the one thing I would correct Alistair with is the Telegraph correspondent didn't have blonde hair. He had brown, black hair. Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks. Do you know what that means? I thought, did Boris Johnson have brown hair
That's
back
who he was
then?
talking. I mean, I didn't. I'd forgotten.
It was Boris Johnson with the blonde hair.
That was Boris Johnson.
It was
he was
always
talking.
blonde, though, wasn't it? Yeah. He just refuses to use his name. That's the only thing. He just. Oh no, Boris, definitely Boris Johnson. Yeah.
No.
Someone else got the mic? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Gary Honeyford and I covered it for Sky News, and I'm finding this all terribly self-congratulatory.
Go on, bring us all down.
I was as exhausted as anyone and totally relieved that there was an agreement, not least for my children. But looking back, did we fail? Was the media just so glad to get out of that place like the politicians?
Yeah.
Were the things that we have done, what we're looking at is, yes, peace, and thank God the numbers that died are not dying now. But it's been a catastrophe on political terms. So did we fail? Was there something we should really have done that we missed?
Tom?
I think it's a very fair question. And my one worry about this whole 25 anniversary was that we would lapse into nostalgia and sentimentality and not ask the hard questions. I don't actually think that has happened. I think there have been some hard questions asked. The way I've thought about it in recent weeks myself is, I think as a peace process, it actually worked in terms of the violence did, by and large, end, not completely, but by and large ended. We did get decommissioning of IRA weapons. We did get consent established as the only principle in which an Irish unification can take place. We did get demilitarization. We did get reform of the RUC. And when you put it like that, that is an amazing list for any society to achieve in a relatively short period of time. As a political process, however, the job's only half done because we don't have stable, never mind good government. And at the minute, that's what we need, good government. So that's the job now, because we are about to get a budget which is going to take a swathe out of public services, unless we can persuade Westminster to invest more here. And the only way to persuade Westminster and the Treasury to invest more here is to get Stormont up and running again.
Right. Interesting. I mean, I interviewed a professor of international law from Oxford the other day on our Talkback programme. He and his team have analysed 1,000 peace agreements and peace processes since 1945, and he places Northern Ireland in the top 5 of the most successful around the world. And I think people back then, in '98, talked a lot about South Africa as a model. And, some people were quite tempted by the model. But look at what has happened in South Africa. 25,000 people murdered in the streets last year alone. It's been a common feature of some peace processes around the world that then it doesn't work. You get resentment, you get regret, you get a sense of disparity, inequality, you get corruption. And you can sometimes tilt back into the war that you had before. That hasn't happened here, has it? How can you call it a catastrophe? Yes, governance is different, though, to a peace process, isn't it?
Well, I call it a catastrophe for a few basic political reasons. There is nothing here that represents policy. There is no one in a majority Conservative government in Westminster who is dragging a certain party in and saying, look, guys, you have 25 years doing nothing. Now is the time to do something. There is no one that is creating a dynamic. And that, to me, well, catastrophe is probably quite a strong word, maybe too strong. But where's the movement? Where is the dynamic that is going to change anything? Where is the strategy? It's all tactics. Year after year, it's tactics.
One more point, and it's over to Tara with our next panel. Go ahead.
Sorry, Jimmy Delargy. While one obviously accepts that the agreement wouldn't have happened without the intervention of both competent and charismatic politicians, I sort of feel, and I don't know whether anybody in the audience feels like this, that there was, especially if you don't subscribe to the great men of history notion, that there was a momentum building up, that people wanted peace for good reasons and bad. They were running out of steam. There was a stalemate. Nobody was going to win. Nobody was going to lose. What was the point of carrying on? Now, that doesn't mean to say that the agreement was inevitable, but would the panel accept that to some extent that this desire for peace was driving things? So if it might not have happened at the time that it did, but eventually there would have been some form of agreement which would have resulted in the sort of, well, it's an unstable political environment, but at least there's no shooting. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Joe.
Well, can I ask you a question? Were you there outside Castle Buildings?
No.
Because there was a man outside. I remember hearing him. I was inside. He was bellowing at us, and mostly bellowing at David Trimble and all the other unionists that were inside. No, no, no. So my answer is no. It wouldn't have happened. We would still be here 25 years later. I have no idea how many people would be dead, because that man, even though he subsequently had a change, not of heart, he was very clever, because he negotiated a little bit of a change in the St. Andrews Agreement, which effectively is what's turned out to be an effective veto that they've been able to exercise on the process. But I honestly believe, yes, you're saying we've had brilliant programmes done by the BBC Northern Ireland going back into the background of what happened in relation to and where the IRA were at and where the British Army were at. But if you think about where we're at today with the huge increase there's been in scrutiny by the intelligence services, you know, it's impossible to imagine we get to here and there would be the kind of agreement we got back then. But it needed momentum and it needed people, leaders showing leadership, and certainly the principals, all of them that sat around that table, particularly John Hume, who took more risks, I would think, than even the man I worked for at the time and others, to get this across, and got huge grief every week in the Sunday Independent about it, his talks with Adams, to try and get them to that point. But you need leaders, and you know that's kind of been missing. I mean, one thing I recall Bertie Ahern saying, you know, we had to use the Hunt system to make it work at the time, but he couldn't envisage still being working in 20 years' time.
Yeah,
and here we are.
I don't doubt that, and John Hume is actually an outstanding. He is a sort of a world historical figure in Irish terms, but I still wonder if. I'm not suggesting that, you know, the thing would have happened no matter who was there, no matter what the contributions were. You needed competent, charismatic politicians to drive the process forward. I'm just suggesting that perhaps the momentum that was building for peace, for an end to conflict, was a very significant factor, and it just really hasn't been talked about as much.
Tom, very briefly, please.
The foundations were laid from the Anglo-Irish Agreement in '85 through the work that John Major did, and that undoubtedly played a major part. However, remember why Sunningdale collapsed. It was a lack of leadership from the government, a lack of political will. There comes a moment where a peace process only works if people are prepared to actually lead it and take a gamble. And that's what worked. Both Bertie Ahern and Tony Blair were prepared to take a gamble. And I would mention Mo Monaghan as well.
Let's thank Tom and Joe and also Alistair, who were here earlier. Over to you. I'm so sorry. I've eaten into my time now.
See you at 9:30, William. Okay, Stephen, Martina, Ken, I think we're going to just bring the chair round, or do you want to go up? Yeah. And Wendy, please join us. Jerry, I'm going to bring some stuff from the floor just because of the lack of seats, but we'll talk to you in a sec. Grab a pew. Great. Thank you so much. I mean, really interesting to hear from the floor, but also from the spin doctors. So it's good to hear the other side. Wendy, I just wonder, there's something that struck me. I came back to Belfast at the end of '97, and having worked in Glasgow for 3 years in a completely different news agenda. And in the first few months, you're on the BBC people will know, you're on the radio desk and you're listening to Good Morning Ulster, so you're listening to you and Seamus presenting every morning, and you're interviewing David Trimble and Martin McGuinness and John Hume. And I remember a few weeks in saying to somebody, and they said that yesterday, why are we interviewing the same people at the same time? How did you get over that kind of interminable repetition and keep the process alive for the listeners at that time? Or do you think that people were invested in it and they just wanted to hear the same thing day after day?
I definitely don't think that. And I don't think any of us did either. I don't know, is it a kind of, are you hoping that something might change? I mean, never did really. I suppose, we swapped it around between us, so you weren't always asking the same person the same questions. I tried to avoid, well, no, you weren't allowed to avoid people, but I was always happier if I didn't have to interview Ian Paisley, because he tended to refer to me as the wee girl from the Larne Times, which thrilled me no end, as you can imagine. It was enormously difficult. When I was listening to Alistair and everybody else, I wrote a few things down. I mean, Tom mentioned the Anglo-Irish Agreement, and we all remember that. No, Hillsborough, all of that stuff. But, you know, Sunningdale, I was in Larne as a cub reporter on the East Antrim Times for the UWC strike. I mean, that worked really well, you know. I was in the 13th floor of Gardenmore House, and there was no electricity for a month. You know, then there were all of those other things, the framework document and the Downing Street Declaration. I mean, but most of you are more interested in the politics side of it than I was. But frankly, you know, your brain glazed over. And by the time we got to this stage, it had been going on forever. I mean, at least I was in a nice, comfy studio, and these guys were all freezing their ass off outside castle buildings, or even worse, in it, which apparently was beyond the pale. I just wanted it to be over and done with.
And was there a sense, I mean, I'll ask all of you this, but was there a sense of, I mean, obviously you need to be impartial and, you know, the BBC and all the rest of it, all journalists have that sense, but, you know, you had young children, you were a member of the community in Northern Ireland. Did you want it to succeed? Did you feel a sense of euphoria whenever the deal was done?
Desperately. I desperately wanted it to succeed. I mean, apart from anything else, I thought the chance of actually being able to ask some questions about something else would be fantastic. And I have to say, this is a revelation, I found my diary from 1998 because I was so desperate to try and remember what I had actually done that week. And I have to tell you that the most important thing is that Joanne is off this week. She looked after the kids for me in the mornings when I went to do Good Morning Ulster. That was a major problem. And I was working on the morning of the Good Friday Agreement. I was doing Good Morning Ulster. But when someone asked me the other day where I was when it all appeared on the television, I was in David Prentice's at Sprucefield signing a hire purchase deal for a Jeep. People have lives. And, you know, we were all trying to live them, and we just wanted to be allowed to get on with them in a way that would maybe keep our kids here whenever they got to the university stage and so on, maybe bring them back whenever they'd qualified, and when you might be able to see your grandchildren on something, well, there weren't Zoom calls then, but something other than a Zoom call. So, yeah, I mean, I was euphoric, and when the vote was passed, I must say that was just terrific.
Ken, when it comes to your position, Liz O'Donnell said she always had Nurofen in her bag for the Stormont headache. And we've heard already tonight about how awful inside castle buildings was. What was it like outside?
Dreadful. People don't realise it went on for weeks, and we're in this wooden hut with hard scones and terrible sandwiches. But there were things that happened that were actually outside Stormont that were actually more important in the long run. I remember St. Patrick's Day, 1998, in the White House. And a lot of people there, Stephen was there, Mo and various others, politicians, and plenty of people with terrorist convictions. It was one of those odd occasions, but I remember that day, George Mitchell took me to one side and said, "What do you think the chances are?" I said, "Oh, this is..." and it was fairly obvious to me talking to George that he was becoming impatient. And he said, "What do you think Trimble will do?" And I don't know, but he's still in the process. And funnily enough, when I thought about that when I came home, I think George Mitchell, by what he said, proved to me that they were going for bust. And, you know, it wasn't long after that, the 10th of April, that we had the agreement. And there was a lot of talk tonight about the spin doctors and so forth. Stephen would have the same experience. They were phoning us because they actually didn't know what David's position was in many places, particularly from Dublin and from Westminster as well. You know, we know.
A lot of coffee that was paid for by the Department of Foreign Affairs.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, Foreign Affairs, I remember a very senior Irish diplomat phoning me on the Thursday morning, up the Hydo, what's happening? And I said, well, you're in there, I don't know, whatever. But one of the other things, I must relate the story because Alistair's gone now, but this is a true story. The referendum campaign, Tom Kelly would know this, there was great unease about the unionist attitude to the agreement. And there was a degree of panic after a while. And there was the night of the U2 thing, Bono, and I don't know how it survived that, but Bono, Trimble and Hume. I was actually in London preparing to interview the Prime Minister, and the next morning I went in and interviewed the Prime Minister, and the room in Downing Street overlooked Horse Guards Parade, where they were rehearsing for Trooping of the Colour. And the song that they were playing was God Bless the Prince of Wales, which, as you know, is the same tune as We'll Guard Old Derry's Walls. And Alistair said, and I said to Blair, do you not think you're overdoing it now to get to the some? Yeah, in the end, it took a lot of courage for a lot of people. And, Mo, I think, not enough is made of Mo Bolam's role. Mo Bolam went to people, she went to the DUP, she went to others. There was no airs and graces about her. And I think the problem, and I heard Alistair earlier on the radio talking about he didn't brief against her. They certainly didn't help her. And at the end, I think that David Trimble and her had a problem. I used to think it was like a university staff room where the politics are really fierce. They just didn't get on, didn't actually like each other very much. And so Trimble wanted the attention of Blair and Bertie Ahern as well. But Mo did a lot of the groundwork. I mean, she went and talked to people. She talked to the DUP extensively. She went to people's homes. And she just broke the mould. And I think that really she deserves much more credit than she was given.
Thank you. Stephen, I'll come to you in a minute. Martina, a senior politician's wife said to me that of all the journalists, you were the worst because you never stopped phoning. They phoned every hour of the day and night. I'll spare your blushes by saying who that was. But, that persistence, you were Belfast Telegraph at the time of the agreement, then you came to the BBC, and you were like a dog with a bone. How did you find that process and being involved, and how do you look back and reflect?
Well, first of all, I didn't agree with what Alistair Campbell said about the media. I was always quite suspicious of him. I was a bit of an outsider then. I was 32. I'd only been in politics for 2 years. I previously had done business. I didn't grow up here, but I had a vested interest. I was born here. And I did not want to be managed. And I didn't really come onto his radar, so I didn't feel a particular need to talk to him, and not that he would have talked to me, but I would have liked to talk to him. But so I spent a lot of my time ringing politicians and annoying their wives. I think Gertrude Mallon pulled the phone out of the socket because I had this early deadline. So I hated, Mark Simpson and I had to ring at 7 a.m. and who wants to talk to anybody at 7 a.m.? But when I say I didn't agree with him, I have a lot of respect for his ability. But yes, the media wanted a deal, generally speaking. But we also wanted a fair deal. And so I don't think you would have just gone up to Derek Henderson or Stephen Grimison or Ken Reid or Dennis Murray and said, you'll just take any deal. I mean, we didn't suspend our critical faculties. We knew the failures of Sunnydale. And a blind man on a galloping horse could have told you what was required. It's the same thing with the Middle East. Everybody knows what needs to be done. Nobody wants to do it. And we had come to this point where we had these amazing political leaders who were prepared, Bertie Ahern and Tony Blair, to give it their time. And I'm probably alone in thinking that I actually quite liked the hand of history comment because it said everything about Tony Blair and his commitment. And without Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern, we wouldn't have had that deal because it required two parents to come in and to, deal with a lot of impetuous behavior, a lot of woundedness within our political framework. And we called it a talks process. But I think back and I thought, it was a listening process too. People need to be heard. And so Billy Graham's here tonight and Deglan and Jerry, we stood outside for 2 years, bored out of our tree. But George Mitchell, who I always called the smiling diplomat, he came in and listened to them. So they vented their spleen. Mm-hmm. I mean, this didn't take 2 years. but it was going to come to a crux. And it's unfortunately, it's stuck, but I was always quite suspicious of spin doctors. I actually found the Irish press officers much easier to deal with because they were trained diplomats, or a lot of them went on to be ambassadors. They would give you information. I remember one of them said in the middle of the night, dealing with the Unionists is like nailing jellyfish. I thought, well, that's brilliant. I found the NIO were much more likely to tell you what time the plenary was at, but much more cautious. They would listen to us and then go back in and probably report, what's Dennis Murray saying, what's Stephen's saying. So without going on at length, but I do remember Declan has said that he'd been drinking with Danny Morrison and Nell McCafferty. And I have this, we were all in a big tent. Alistair Campbell came in. There was just a knot of English reporters hanging on his every word. And I thought, oh, well, he is the daddy of all spin doctors. But he was going on about progress being made. And I could see like the Irish and the Northern Irish journalists were probably more circumspect. But Nell, I think that whiskey kicked in because she stood on a chair. It's one of the few really defining moments. She stood on a chair in a rain hat and she just said, oh, will you cut to the chase? Are you getting out of our country or are you not? And Alistair Campbell actually stopped speaking for about 3 seconds. He looked at her and decided she was completely mad, and he just went back to speaking. But anyway, that's my sense of it.
Martina, thanks. Stephen, if you only had one story to tell about that time, what would it be? What's your best anecdote?
There's a lot. and Ken and I together, there's still some stories we can't tell because the people involved in them have to die yet. So, it really is quite bad. But there was earlier a brief discussion, and which would probably need a broader discussion about the social media and could we have done this with social media. And I was in a position where we absolutely couldn't have done it with social media. And then I began to think, and then you realised there was a general mood out there which was going in a certain direction. That who would have been the muscle for the DUP to bring this down apart from themselves? They've always needed loyalist muscle. The loyalist muscle was in the camp with David Trimble. It was one of the genius ploys that Trimble went into those talks flanked by the loyalists, the very people who are the only people who can bring this down on the streets. So it would have certainly have not made life any easier and would have probably led to a closer result. But I'm not entirely convinced that social media, given where society was, given where the parties were, given the general tiredness, that it would have actually brought it all down. So we could argue this back and forth, and some days I think yes, and some days I think no. But I think to forget about the mood there was in this place at that time would be a huge mistake. And certainly in terms of the risk, I mean, you've got to remember that 90% of this deal was pretty much on the table before we hit the last week. And if I may say so, the people who nearly wrecked it were the two prime ministers, because they put a strand 2 paper into this with about 50 cross-border bodies in it, and said to George Mitchell, because he told me afterwards, they said it wasn't to be opened. It was you just slot that in and leave that, and nobody can change it. And it was the very thing that almost brought the whole house down. And then if you look at the final document, what the cross-border bodies are versus that document, if it hadn't been for a bit of overreach, at that particular moment, we might have been in a different place. But at the same time, had that overreach not been there, would Bertie have been able to get that through his party? So, you look at all these things, and I think in the end, there was a certain tide in the history that was happening that probably got us over the line.
I'll take some questions from the floor, but Jerry, I just wanted to come to you. Was there a difference at that time between the audience and the readership south of the border and north of the border? And was that something you were aware of?
I'll take it back to what Martina said and what Tony Blair said about the hand of history on our shoulder. I remember being in Hillsborough Castle when Tony Blair made that comment, I was standing beside Ian Graham from PA, and there was a general sort of collective groan from everybody because we felt it had to be Alistair that wrote it, but he said he didn't. But what my memory of that time, and as Martina said and Declan said, we were there 2 years going up to Stormont every day, and Ken was saying that they provided sandwiches and scones for us. They didn't. They provided sandwiches and scones when the international media turned up with about a week to go, and we had to badger Tom Kelly and Alistair for them to provide it. But what really impressed me, and Gary was talking about self-congratulation, and we have to avoid that, of course, but the sense of relief at what was achieved. And that wonderful speech that George Mitchell gave this week, it was so fresh, it was so inspiring, and it captured that it was a historic moment. And I certainly felt, I remember when they came out at 5 o'clock and the deal was done, and Declan was Northern editor at the time. I remember sort of shaking his hand because I felt sort of so relieved, so happy that this had been achieved. We had 2 kids at the time. My third son was born 6 days afterwards, and that's why I missed the photograph that morning of all the reporters. But it was a huge moment in history, and I think most of us were sort of conscious of it. And you asked about sort of the readership, and our editor at the time was Conor Brady, and Joe made reference to what the attitude that the Sunday Independent took to John Hume and all the grief that he got. But Conor Brady, and he took a very conscious decision, to be as supportive of the Good Friday Agreement and of all the negotiations as he could. And a lot of resources were put into the Irish Times. 2 reported. Mary Holland came up, Frank Miller. We did a big team there. And I remember he wrote two front page editorials, so which is unheard of for the paper. So we were conscious that this was a big moment, that if it didn't go right, that the war could continue or could resume. And again, some people forget is that 25 years ago and beyond, we thought this was going to go on forever, that our daily job would be sort of killings and funerals and bombings and nothing else. So the level of relief and happiness, and somebody used the word euphoria of that day, I'll certainly never forget it. And we can be a cynical bunch, but Good Friday 1998 is a day that I will never be cynical about or never be blasé about.
Okay, Jerry, thanks. Anyone, I'm aware of Ken's time. Anyone got a specific question for Ken or a comment? Because I know that you have to get back. Yeah, David, or sorry.
White coats are coming from
Well, I didn't want to tell the whole audience that. Billy.
Hi. Yeah. Billy Graham here, William Graham. Yeah, I've been a journalist since 1968. When I entered the trade at 17. So I covered the early civil rights marches, part of the Bruntallet March, the early violence, then I became a political correspondent. But I would just say at this stage, it's good to look back, and that was probably the greatest moment in my political career in terms of journalism, as a political journalist. The Good Friday Agreement, but we need to look forward also, and I should say that I've been retired from daily journalism for 12 years now. I write an occasional piece, but like 80% of my time is spent on volunteer community work. That involves dialogue with Christian, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish church leaders. It also involves behind-the-scenes dialogue with politicians from every party. This is all underneath the radar. There are no journalists attending these events, nor do I want them to. There is no engagement with social media. There are no appearances or dialogue with radio talk shows. This is built from the community up, and this is what we're doing and trying to do in a whole lot of different places in Northern Ireland. And I just hope that this can maybe gradually improve the situation and deal with the cancer of sectarianism that we all have to deal with. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks. David, just briefly, because the clock's against us, but if you do have something to add there, that'd be great.
Look, I don't know where to start and finish with this. Look, it's great. It's great to see so many people here tonight, and a lot of people who were very, very active at the time of the Good Friday Agreement. Ken and Stephen in particular. I mean, absolute legends. I can't speak highly enough of them. They're two of the finest people I've ever worked with in journalism, and I just take my hat off. It's just so good to have them here with us tonight, and that's no disrespect to Joe or Alistair and Tom. Look, what I will say about the Good Friday Agreement is, and I mean, I've done a few podcasts recently, and you'll have seen a few articles that I've written. I've kind of come back from the dead in a PR sense politically. It was a very, very finely balanced decision on the 10th of April 1998. We had to make a judgment on that afternoon, and we knew the language on decommissioning in the agreement wasn't right, and it wasn't going to explicitly compel the IRA to decommission. We knew prisoner releases was going to be toxic within unionism, and we knew the reform of policing was going to be a problem. But I think David Trimble took the view strategically they were short-term issues, and that the longer-term structural institutional piece for unionism and for nationalism for these islands was a good thing and was going to be a good deal for us and a foundation for peace building. Gary mentioned it, and I welcome Gary Honeyford's honesty, because we do need to be honest, folks, about where we're at in this country. There's no point everybody running around here patting themselves in the back. I could do it, and lots of people could do it. There were weaknesses in the agreement, and the two governments, in my opinion, and Conal McDevitt and I talked about this with Mark Crothers a couple of weeks ago, the two governments were far, far too soft on the paramilitaries in 98, 99 and 2000 in the implementation of the agreement. And David Trimble, in my view, was thrown under the bus in 1999 because instead of the government's pressing for IRA and loyalist decommissioning, they put the pressure on him to go into government without any decommissioning. And that led to huge political instability in those years and caused no end of problems, and ultimately cost him his political career. So I do blame the two governments for being soft on paramilitarism at that time, and they're still being soft on paramilitaries. And I think we have a problem today because we weren't assertive enough as a society at that time to say to these people, enough, and to resource the police and the security services to put these people out of business. I think we have the political institutions right. I think we have the power sharing arrangements right. Yes, they need tweaked, they need reformed, but we've got to deal with paramilitaries in this country, and we've got to deal with organised criminality, and we also have to deal at the heart of it, and Willie's talked about it here with sectarianism. I do believe integrated education is a fundamentally strategic necessity for this country to build reconciliation. And I'll finally say this, Tara, because we do need to have perspective, folks. I believe this is a 50-year project, and I've said this a number of times recently. It's a two-generation project for us to move away from the trauma of the troubles that we lived through. So we do have to have perspective. The next 25 years, we're going to have to be brave, and we're going to have to push the boundaries, and we're going to have to take risks again to make this society the place that we all know it can be. But I do believe we'll get there.
Okay, David, thanks. Thank you so much. Ken, I just want to give the last word to you. I'm so sorry, but the time really is against us. But do you agree with David that this was a 50-year project, that this 25 years is a time to look at the next 25 years?
Yeah, the day of the Good Friday Agreement was the biggest event in most of our political lives, as Billy said. One of the problems was, I felt afterwards the government started to take their eye off the ball. And yes, they did sacrifice David Trimble. And then sort of the Ulster Unionist Party was in many ways destroyed, SDLP struggling in a terrible state. But the part of the agreement that people didn't pay enough attention to, there was room in there for review. And the fact is that the centre ground is growing, and yet it's not catered for in terms of the agreement. And that's something that can be sorted out within the auspices of what has been agreed. Now, I think that's important, because one of the things that would worry me is a turn-off of politics, people not being interested. I mean, at the hospital at the moment, talking to nurses and various people, doctors and all, I get the impression a lot of them just aren't that interested at the moment. And I think that we need to be careful with that, because, as David said, it probably is a 50-year project, and the only way to make progress is to get people involved. And, you know, their vote is important, but Stormont, essentially, for anything to happen, must be back up and running as soon as possible.
Okay, Ken, Wendy, Stephen, Martina, thanks very much. Look, William's going to come back for the next panel. Thought you disappeared, William. Ken, thanks a million. Hand over the baton.
Let me welcome onto the stage Derek Henderson, Noreen Erskine, Denzel McDaniel, and Susan McKay. Please welcome them onto our stage. Come on up, guys. Fabulous, good to have you. Come on in, Derek, grab a mic. Corky, welcome. Good to see you. Yeah. Oh. I can't count. All right. Sorry, Denzel. We've got one mic each. Good. All right. So we've been talking first of all about government communications and how that related to journalists, and also the experience of journalists relating back, as it were, to government communications. Sometimes listening, sometimes pushing back, not losing your critical faculties. That was absolutely clear. Not just simply being compliant for the sake of it. But there's another feature to being a journalist, of course, which is always true, and that is that you're not a robot. You're not a journalistic robot. You're a human being. You're a person. You're a citizen. You have hopes. You have families. You have friends. You sometimes have lost family and friends, like other members of society. So we want to talk in this session for 15 or 20 minutes about how you and how others here managed to negotiate the relationship with yourself, really. Derek, would you start for us? How you held that? There's a tension there, isn't there? Maybe moral dilemmas as well. You know something, but you know this might actually have an effect that would be very detrimental to a peace that you as a person and as a citizen would like to see happening.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed. Just before I start, I'm going to tell you a couple of stories, actually, but before I start, I just want to set the record straight. Grimacin scooped us all. You know, I've been sitting outside or standing outside castle buildings for about the best part of 7-8 years. And this day of all day, there he is on the screen. I have it in my hand. This is the piece of paper, and I'm saying, I can't repeat what I said. And of course, the first thing you do, you go into defensive mode. And he's right to a point. I rang the London news desk and said, listen very carefully to what I have to say. There are people purporting to have this agreement, waving it about in front of the TV screens. I says, I want you to ignore that. I'll be bringing you the story as soon as I get it. So would you please wait? And Derek said, okay, we'll leave it with you. And I said, that's fine. Put the phone down, and I says, Christ, where is Grimacin? So, but there's a sequel to that story, and I don't think I've ever told it before until tonight. It's an interesting one. As you all know, we had the agreement, and what 6-7 weeks later, and yes, Grimison scooped me on the agreement, and I said, "You'll not do it a second time." And I remember the day of the referendum count in the King's Hall in Belfast, and the man in charge of it was a man called Pat Bradley. He was the returning officer for all the various constituencies in Northern Ireland. And I knew somebody very close to him. And I said at the start of the count, if you can slip me that result before it's officially announced, I'll make it worth your while. And I'm saying, I'm depending on you. And sure enough, the ballots are all counted, and my good friend comes over to me at the side of the hall, says it's 72% for, 28% against. He gave me the exact figures. I went straight to the phone, called the London news desk, and said, "Listen, this is the result." It was the best 300 quid I've ever invested. As regards the actual the agreement itself, I always found, in many ways, that was the easiest part of the whole process. The referendum thing was I think, won comfortably. It was a hell of a campaign, and Tom Kelly was heavily involved in all of that, and a few others. But it was the implementation of the agreement, which was the hard part, in my view, and it still is. More on that later. But I was listening to Gerry Adams this week, giving interviews, his memories of Good Friday and so on, and the fallout from that. And I'll be the first to acknowledge the contribution Gerry Adams and Sinn Féin did in terms of bringing this whole peace process about. But I was astonished when he, in the course of his interviews, I can't remember who it was with, if it was Mark Carruthers or whoever it was, he said that he didn't realise the pressure Trimble was under, that until he attended David Trimble's funeral. And I just could not believe that. And I'll tell you why. And again, this is a story that I don't think I've ever repeated before. Post the referendum, Trimble, once again, was under enormous pressure. He's due to have another Ulster Unionist Council meeting in the Waterfront Hall. The pressure's on. And a couple of days before his next summit, we were getting a briefing by Sinn Féin. And basically they were saying, if Trimble thinks that we're going to, these aren't his words, but basically, if Trimble thinks we're going to roll over and give him his decommission commitment before Saturday's meeting, he's another thing coming. And it was the first time I think I've ever done it in my life, and I don't think I've ever spoken of it before. It was such a defining moment in that whole process. If we were to run the story, or if the journalists that day were to run the story, that the IRA, or not the IRA, but Sinn Féin were ruling out any chances of a commitment in terms of decommissioning, that was Trimble gone. He was finished. And we decided to pull the story. Mally, of course, was first out of the blocks. He was out on the 3 o'clock news bulletin. But we said, listen, nobody listens to you anyway, so we needn't worry. And we got him to pull the story for the 4 o'clock bulletin. And we yourselves pull that story, because that was the pressure that as journalists, and I heard some people talking about journalists and their emotional involvement in this whole process. Yes, we were cheerleaders for the agreement, and I make no bones about that. And not all journalists, it should be said, backed the agreement. There were a few dissident voices among our crowd who weren't happy, who felt that the provost had caved in and had surrendered more or less. I mean, I don't see them in this audience tonight, and that's fair enough. But, you know, for journalists who worked here, like myself, from day one, you know, we wanted this agreement. We wanted to get this over the line. We wanted it to work. And we would have done anything to get it, as Jerry Moriarty articulated much better than me, done anything. It meant an awful lot to us. It wasn't the best story I've ever did. It was the biggest story, and something I'll never forget. And just to wrap up very quickly, I think we're in a much better place. We're in a much better place. But think of where we should be and ought to be. I think what's happening, not just in recent weeks and months, but in the 25 years since the Good Friday Agreement, there has been so many wasted years and months. And I just think it's a terrible shame. And you're right. I mean, until such times as this place is up and running again, you know, we're going nowhere.
Thank you, Derek. Let's bring the others in, and please talk to each other. We'll bring the audience in too. But Susan, in terms of your embodied humanity as a journalist, the emotional core of you, how did you negotiate that relationship with yourself? Grab a microphone, yeah.
I think it's very, is my mic on, okay?
Yes.
I think it's really moving to be in this gathering of journalists here tonight, and to recognise people here who have played such a great part in covering this place over many, many years. But I think there's two journalists who aren't here tonight, and I think that their absence should be a very sobering reminder as to why we shouldn't be sitting here being self-congratulatory in any way, either as citizens or as journalists. And those two people are Martin O'Hagan and Lyra McKee, and it's actually the 4th anniversary today of the murder of Lyra McKee. Martin O'Hagan was killed by dissident loyalists in Lurgan, and Lyra McKee was killed by dissident Republicans in Derry. And one of the worst things that I can think of that I know about the North today is that there is now a cross-community drugs gang in the Mid-Ulster area, which is made up of the sons of some of the people who were involved in those killing years of the 1990s, because the killings didn't stop over the period of the Good Friday Agreement. And I wasn't Northern editor of the Sunday Tribune at that time. Ed Maloney was in that role, and Ed was, I think it's fair to say, very preoccupied with the Republican part of what was going on. And I ended up spending a lot of time over those years down at Drumcree, and I was never particularly interested in the whole sort of business which interested a lot of the boy journalists, if I may be so disparaging, which was, you know, who was brigadier of what company and what estate, wherever. I was much more interested in the culture that gave rise to the loyalist paramilitarism, which was very apparent down there, and the murderousness of it that was going on at that time. And, you know, in terms of humanity, I remember very, very clearly the morning listening. I was staying at my parents' house in Derry and listening to the radio and hearing about the murder of the Quinn children in Ballymoney. And I drove from Derry to Portadown in a state of absolute white rage and despair. You know, and as soon as I arrived in Drumcree, I went and spoke to the late Willie Fraser, as it happens, and he started telling, you know, he was there with his sash on representing the Orange Order and God knows who as well, and he said, oh, it was nothing to do with us, and started talking about how the mother of the children had been responsible for their deaths, and it was horrendous, the sort of stuff that was being said at Drumcree. That was the fulcrum of those who were opposed to the Good Friday Agreement. And in terms of, we were asked to reflect on, you know, what it was like as citizens to be asked asked, to be criticised for being negative about the Good Friday Agreement. But I had no choice but to be negative because I was covering the sectarian murders, which were being encouraged by people from within the unionist hierarchy, I'm afraid, including some members of unionist political parties. And I remember writing a piece in the Washington Post about how one of the murderers of young James Morgan in County Down had been an Orange man, and how he had not been thrown out of the Orange Order, even though he had confessed to killing the teenager. And a unionist MP tried to get the Washington Post to apologise and claimed that they were going to sue both the paper and me. And the Washington Post just said to me, is it true that this happened? And I said, yes, it is true. And they said, well, then we're not apologising, and there'll be no suing, and we will defend you against anybody who does sue you. But I think that notion that we were supposed to only reflect good news at the time is kind of nonsense. Like, if the Good Friday Agreement wasn't capable of withstanding the scrutiny of some very seasoned journalists, it was not going to withstand the years that followed.
Fascinating. Thank you very much, Susan. Corky, I mean, and let's throw this in the air as well. There were journalists who were there, first on the scene when bodies were found, who were there when terrible atrocities happened too. And over the years, some have wondered about PTSD and the kind of traumatic impact on the lives of those who were there covering some of those events. Your thoughts on the emotional challenge?
Well, there were some journalists who suffered very personally. For instance, Johnny Watterson, who is a highly respected sports writer on the Irish Times, he lost his 15-year-old brother, Peter, when he was shot outside the family's newsagent shop on the Falls Road in 1973. Then there were journalists like Jim Campbell, the former editor of the Sunday World, who was wounded during an assassination attempt, I think in the 80s, I think it was, wasn't it? So there were some journalists who experienced trauma at its most extreme point. But I do think that, with exceptions, obviously the victims and their families were, if you like, at the top of the trauma scale. But I also think that we forget very often that the emergency services saw sites that we were largely shielded from, for the most part, because usually we didn't get there to an event like a bombing or a shooting until after it had happened. There were some exceptions, but as a general rule, that happened to be the case. Mm-hmm. Now, there was a policeman, I mean, my first job in journalism was in 1972, and I was about to take it up after the Bloody Friday bombings in Belfast, in which 20 bombs, IRA bombs, were planted, and 9 people were killed and many others injured. And I can remember, and I'm sure many other people here who were watching television that evening can remember watching young policemen shoveling human remains into plastic bags. Now, for the most part, we didn't have to experience that firsthand, but for the emergency services, the ambulance crews, the fire crews, the police, and also soldiers at that time, they had to deal with that sort of thing. And indeed, nurses and doctors had to deal with the wounded. Mm. So we never had to see that, for the most part, firsthand. Now, having said that, I only ever once was involved in an actual bombing, and Derek, I think, was also, we were both working for the Belfast Telegraph at the time. This was in 1976. The IRA bombed the Telegraph buildings on Royal Avenue. And we were in the building at the time when there was a tannoy warning saying, please leave the building, there was a bomb. And basically what had happened was the IRA had hijacked a van in North Belfast and forced the driver to drive down and park it in the loading bay on the ground floor of the Telegraph building. We were on the newsroom on, was it the 3rd floor? Yeah. And as the bomb went off, as we were running towards the stairs, and I have 2 memories of that day in particular. One was the fact that there was a lot of yellow smoke after the explosion, and I remember looking down at the floor and seeing the shoelaces of the person in front of me were undone, And I remember thinking, if he falls, I'm going to fall over him. And the other memory I have of that day was the smell. In those days, whatever the components were and the bombs that they were using, the smell was like marzipan. And for years afterwards, at Christmas time, having Christmas cake, and I'd smell the marzipan, and a little flicker in my head would go back to that day of the Belfast Telegraph bomb.
I think Paul Muldoon wrote a poem, didn't he, about the marzipan?
I think he did, yes.
And, of course, remember Broadcasting House as well, experienced a bombing. Denzel?
Well, I come from a weekly newspaper background, and I think one of the things I would say about the weeklies is that we're very close to the community, too close sometimes. Many an occasion, if I went out for a pint on a Saturday night, I was harangued by somebody whose court case was in the paper that week. It had its advantages and disadvantages. But one thing for sure is you knew what people thought. They almost thought it was their paper. So you were very close to them. I was interested yesterday to hear George Mitchell talk about the anger between the two sides at the talks. That was actually reflected in the community. And we talk to people all the time. By way of context, I come from Enniskillen, and from our South Tyrone. You know, throughout the 70s and early 80s, the campaign was in full swing. Part of my reporting duties was to call with families to get a correct photograph and to get a quote. So you saw it firsthand, the pain and the hurt. The 80s was a very difficult time in Fermanagh, South Tyrone. We had the Bobby Sands election in 81. Seamus McElwain, the IRA escapee, was shot dead by the SAS in 86. The Enniskillen bomb in 87. There was a lot going on, and there were great divisions between the two communities. So by the time 94 came and the ceasefires, it was a very difficult time for people to accept. Our role, as I saw it in the paper, was to reflect everybody's opinion and to give. I'm not quite sure whether that happens as much now, but at the end of the day, when it came to 98, it wasn't just differences between the two communities. It was differences within communities and within parties. Again, coming back to Fermanagh, South Tyrone, what we had was, for example, Sam Foster was from Enniskillen. Sam Foster was a hardliner who protested on the streets against the Anglo-Irish Agreement. Orange man, very high up in the Royal Black Institution, all sorts of stuff like that there. He backed Trimble. James Cooper was a solicitor who was the chairman of the Ulster Unionist Party, backed Trimble. In James Cooper's office, he had a young solicitor working for him called Arlene Foster, who was very much against what was happening. And one of her allies at the time was Tom Elliott. So there were differences, and they all wanted their say in the paper, and it was our duty to do that. In fact, many a phone call came in to say they weren't happy with what so-and-so was saying, so-and-so was saying. On the other side of the coin, I had got to know a lot of Republicans. Sometimes I used to play a bit of football. A lot of friends in the Republican movement, and many of them were unhappy with the Adams leadership. So there are great divisions within communities on both sides. Now, the paper took an editorial line to back the agreement, and having seen, as a family man, having seen what was happening to other families and to individuals, again, going back to what Senator Mitchell said, these weren't stats, these were people, these were real people, which we knew in many cases. So I wanted to see it come to an end. The paper took an editorial stance to back the agreement, but our role as journalists meant that we had to also give space and time to give space in the paper to voices who were opposed to the agreement as well. So it was quite difficult to do that at times, but we had to do it. It was part of our I do feel sometimes now that we've moved on from that, and you know, we have more of a polemic in newspapers and radio nowadays, whereas then, back in the sort of 80s and 90s, journalists took it quite seriously to give everybody a voice.
What about alcohol? What about marriage breakdowns? What about mental health? And the effects of all of that, even the tautness that you might go through during that period, or the nervousness, it has an effect long term on you, doesn't it?
There were a couple of, Hendy talked about stories. There were a couple of things that happened to me. In the late 80s, I was having a drink in a pub one night in Enniskillen, and a bomb went off close by. And instinct at the time, dashed down to see. It was only 50 yards away. So before any security forces or anybody was on the scene, I was there and saw what turned out to be a girl that I knew very well and had been to school with. And it was a pretty horrendous scene, which I'll never, ever forget. I also remember in 97, I wrote a book about the Enniskillen bomb and the 10th anniversary. And as you all know, 11 people were killed in the Enniskillen bomb. And one man was seriously injured called Ronnie Hill. And he was in a coma for 13 years. I went to interview Noreen Hill for the book. At that stage, Ronnie had been in a coma for 10 years. We did the interview. Noreen spoke brilliantly and then said, "Will you come and see Ronnie?" So she brought me down to the room where Ronnie was, this man who had been in a coma for 10 years. And she began to speak to him as a wife would speak to a husband. And then turned and said, "Denzel's here, Ronnie." So she asked me to speak to Ronnie. And that's something that was quite emotional and quite difficult to do. So there were all sorts of things like that happened to people. Yeah. We also saw a lot of, I mentioned earlier on about going to see families, to see homes. And you still meet those people today, and some of their traumatic experiences are still with them. Alcohol, yes, I think, today perhaps I think we should have had counselling or whatever, but we didn't. Yeah. We didn't. We coped with it. We coped with the support in some cases of alcohol, yes. In some cases, people had a faith or whatever their coping mechanism was, but there were really, really difficult times. And a bit like Derek, when it came to that in 98, I wanted to see an end to that. Yeah. And yes, there were failures in the agreement. I think one of the failures actually was that the issue of legacy has never been addressed. Sure. But there were successes, and the big success, sorry to keep quoting George Mitchell, but when he quoted the figures, it really struck me to say, in the previous 25 years, so many people had died, 3,500 people had died, 50,000, and since that, 167. I'm going, whatever else we say about it, the human misery and the cost of human lives, that alone is worth the success of the agreement.
Yeah.
I mean, back in the day, journalists, and when I talk back in the day, I'm talking when the Troubles were going full pelt. Journalists made for pretty lousy partners because they were never there. I got married in 1978, mixed marriage, and this year, I think, marks the 43rd anniversary of the marriage, and every year we give each other a medal. Has survived, but it does take, there's no doubt about it, it takes a terrible toll, it took a terrible toll on a lot of us. Loughlin Island did it for me. I remember it was a Sunday morning. The previous night we had partied with friends in a house in South Belfast. Our sons had won a mini rugby tournament at Ravenhill the previous day, and we were, elated, to put it mildly. A lot of drink was consumed, as you can imagine. And I remember getting the phone call that Saturday night to tell me about Loughlin Island. And I knew that I was going there the next morning. And back then, journalists were pretty generous with their time and with their friendship. There wasn't that, because of the circumstances, there wasn't that sort of cutthroat rivalry. So we arrived down at Loughlin Island on the Sunday morning, me with a thumping hangover, and John Mullen from The Guardian was there, Richard Kay from The Mail, Richard Ford from The Times, myself, a couple of guys up from Dublin, The Independent, the Press. And what you did then, you gathered and you said, right, you go to that house, you go to that house, I'll go to this house, and whatever it is. And I always remember knocking the door of this house in Loughlin Island, and I think she was the daughter of the elderly man who was killed. And she comes to the door, and her eyes are red. She's fingering a white handkerchief. She's obviously retrieved a black dress from the bottom drawer because it's covered in white fluff. And she's in a very distressed state. And as usual, you say you apologise for intruding at such a difficult time, and how sorry you are for her and her family. But I'd be grateful if you could just give me a few minutes to tell me what you heard or what had happened about the previous night. And she took off her glasses and she said, Derek, because I told her who it was, I'm really sorry, I don't really have anything more to say. And with that, she just turned and closed the door. And I walked down the path that morning and I swore I would never knock on another door. And I didn't. So that's the toll it took.
Corky, when you look back on your reporting for the Troubles era, what's the incident? What's the moment that immediately you go back to?
Well, I was one of the foot soldiers, I suppose. I wasn't one of the stars of the political Good Friday Agreement at all, even though I appeared briefly in the film. But I was really one of the foot soldiers, and most of my work was covering either doing interviews with bereaved families or else the funerals. So, in fact, when the Good Friday Agreement became a deal, my overwhelming feeling was one of relief. And hope that I wouldn't have to do this for much longer. But I suppose there were so many stories, all of them heartbreaking. I do remember one particular story. It was of a policeman who had been killed in a car bomb outside Armagh, and I went to interview his widow, and the couple had a 5-year-old boy, and she had agreed to do an interview, and we were sitting in her sitting room, and I said to her, "How did you tell your little boy?" And there was a pause, and then she said, I won't use his name, but she said, "Did Daddy die because I was bold, because I was bad?" And I'm afraid I dissolved into tears. Unprofessional, maybe, but
no.
I found it just so very difficult. Yeah. And that memory of that child's reaction and that woman's generosity in giving me her time to tell me that story. This was the one thing that I was constantly astonished by, the number of people who were prepared to talk to journalists. We were, for the most part, strangers to them, in that we hadn't met them in the past. And I was constantly amazed at how many people actually did agree to talk. Now, there were many who didn't, or, as Derek has said, given an example of one. But for those who did, their generosity was what overwhelmed, was the overwhelming impression that I was left with.
And Susan, I wonder, obviously you've done so much work in this, in your books, but whether part of that relationship between the family of a victim and a journalist is a desire, almost a duty of love, a desire to chronicle a life, to remember, to say they lived. I want them remembered.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an incredible generosity and nobility in many of the families here, and the way that they worked with journalists, and how very gracious they were when we were intruding upon them in their worst moments, you know. And actually I found, and I'm sure lots of other journalists found it as well, sometimes you'd go back to people who had been literally blown open by grief and had talked to you so frankly immediately after, an atrocity in which they had suffered, and a couple of years later or on some anniversary you'd go back and they were quite embarrassed to have spoken in that way, because they felt, well, we didn't die, you know, that they felt that they were survivors and that the people who were the actual victims were the people who had died. But it's funny because I was just thinking about Noreen talking about emergency services there, and I remember interviewing this very formidable nun whose name I can't remember, but she had run the Royal Victoria Hospital during the 1970s, and I was interviewing her on her retirement, and she'd just written a book, and I said, did she never feel that she was overwhelmed by any of the things that she had seen? And she said, well, not really, but I do remember the McGurk's bar bombing. And I said, and why, what is it you remember about it? And she said, well, it was a bit hard. She said, I took a quarter of a Valium. And this was her, this was for her the absolute, you know, admission of weakness,
Yes.
you know. But just in terms of the way that...
well, that's the normalisation of that life, yeah.
But the way that people were, you know, I think about... I mentioned earlier James Morgan, the 16-year-old boy who was beaten to death during the Drumcree years. And I just often think about his parents, who were among the parents who welcomed me into their home immediately afterwards. And Justin and Philomena Morgan went on to become some of those people who spoke out in favour of getting people to vote yes in the referendum for the Good Friday Agreement, even though it was going to mean that the one of the two killers of their son, who had only just gone into prison, would be released again. And I think it's really, really important to remember those people, and I think it is something that a lot of journalists in this room have been excellent on, is covering legacy issues and appreciating the courage that it took for families to put themselves in the public domain by talking to journalists, and indeed put themselves in the public domain for calling for something that must have been incredibly painful for them personally. In terms of the lasting impact of doing all that work on me, I just feel that there's a kind of a residue of sorrow that never really goes away. You know, I'm sure lots of people in this room feel that. You know, it's just a kind of a feeling that you'll not ever forget the things that you saw and the things that you heard, and, you know, all of the suffering that was there during those years. But it's difficult to find a balance now, isn't it, between sort of just saying something really glib, like, well, of course we're in a better place now, because a lot of people are in quite a bad place now, and a lot of people are still suffering, and a lot of those people are in the areas that were worst afflicted during the Troubles as well. And I think that, you know, the current absence of government at Stormont and the current negligent government that's coming from Westminster is making matters very, very much worse for people who have already experienced the sharp end of everything bad over the last 50 years.
Thank you very much, Susan, and thank you, all of you. Really appreciate it. And we really just touched the surface, but, you know, mentioning Martin and Lyra and people, journalists also, who were injured visibly, and also in many ways invisibly too over the years. I really appreciate it. We'll carry our questions on into the next session. Thank you all very much, guys. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, it just makes me think that that kind of residue of sadness that Susan talked about there is probably kind of right across the room. So we are kind of, the bar is open afterwards. Not that we should all go and drown our sorrows. I don't mean it that way, but I just mean it'd be really useful for people to kind of talk about some of those, because we just don't really have the time. And I'm sure everybody in this room has one or two or 20 or 100 stories. So it's just kind of mind yourselves after this, definitely. I'd like to ask our next panel to come up. Alison Morris, Ben Lowry, Freya McClement, sorry, Freya, and Noel Doran. Thank you. Oh, brilliant. Thanks. Freya, do you want to take that? Just sit there, grand. So we've had a lot of chat tonight, and I suppose this session, I'm very aware that we're kind of already at our finishing time, so we'll keep this reasonably brief, but I do think it's important to have that social media chat that we talked about a little bit earlier on, and I would like to start by asking each of you to reasonably briefly tell us what you think in terms of social media. Ben, I'll start with you. You have a microphone there. You know, the newsletter obviously had its role to play back in 1998, and I suppose that role has perhaps changed over the years, and now you're in charge. But do you think that social media would have made a difference to the talks process? Would we have had a Good Friday Agreement?
I don't know. Yes, no. And by the way, yes, we were, as most people will remember, maybe younger people won't know, we were sort of rabidly pro the Belfast Agreement. Personally, I wonder, in retrospect, even though I was nothing to do with the newsletter then, was in my 20s and was also pro the Belfast Agreement very strongly, living in London, I wonder whether it was a mistake for the newsletter to be so strongly pro, because I think there's no question that tonight that Derek was candid about it, that the thrust within the media, very professional and brilliant journalists and amazing stuff being done, but the thrust within the media was pro the agreement, and I do wonder whether, with hindsight, the newsletter should have been so strongly pro. In answer to the question about social media has changed everything, and yet we don't yet know whether it's really changed very much, by which I mean this. When I show young people a copy of the first surviving newsletter from 1738 of the world's oldest English language daily, which was 1737, but the first surviving paper is the next year, and I hold it up to them, I wish I had it with me actually, and I say, what's different between this and a newsletter from today? The only difference is basically a photograph, a colour photograph. Okay, there's still a masthead and there's words and so on. In fact, at the newsletter, like a lot of papers, we went towards picture front pages that we retreated from because people want words. Why do I tell you that when I'm answering about social media? I don't know how social media is going to work out. It's blown the world apart in some ways. At the same time, for 300 years, people have wanted the same fundamental format in a newspaper. And I'm not saying newspapers aren't in trouble, because I think there are very big challenges for newspaper. I'm saying that hasn't changed in 300 years. You would have thought that radio would have finished it. You would have thought that cinema would have finished it. You would have thought, certainly, that TV would have finished it. And then the internet. And so we don't know whether people will still, in the same way that the BBC hasn't vanished because of Netflix, will still turn to traditional media forms.
Yeah, I mean, there are wider questions, I suppose, around the future of print media and digital and all the rest of it. We can maybe get that in towards the end. Alison, what's your take on that?
I think that, I suppose, the biggest change that I have noticed in the years that I've been a journalist is that I was glad that Denzel mentioned weekly papers, is that the vast majority of journalists originally came on a traditional route. So you went to your weekly local paper, you learnt your trade, and that's what I did. I started in a weekly paper. You did that for several years, then you might have moved to a daily paper, then you might have moved into broadcasting, and that's a route that most of us of a certain age in this room took. Those weekly papers and the sort of, I suppose, the demise of the weekly press especially is really noticeable. I could always notice when I worked in a newsroom, if I was at a news conference, I could have told you without even, asking them who came through the weekly papers and who just landed straight in the daily, because the ones who came through the weekly papers had a list of stories ready to go. They had a context book that was bulging. They were ready to, and the ones who had landed a nice cushy daily journalist job were waiting for someone giving them a story to go and cover for that day. You always brought your own stuff. Social media has had a big change. It has positives as well. I mean, we talk about the negatives of social media, but it means that you reach your readership instantly and immediately. I love change and I love multimedia, and my industry has changed dramatically in the years that I've been in it. We're talking about digital first. We're now a lot of my working week is done doing podcasts. It's going to do, if you do a story, the story now is presented numerous different ways. You might do a video while you're interviewing the person, then you write it up as a news story, then it goes online, it also goes in the paper, then you do a podcast. One story isn't just a story now, it's multiple things, and I actually enjoy that aspect of it. We can't be dinosaurs, we have to change, we have to advance with technology, and we have to move on. But then the fact I feel sad that some of the younger journalists don't have that, be able to sort of learn their craft that way. But then in other ways, they're born with a phone in their hands, so they know all that technology. They don't need to be trained on how to use it, and they're coming up with new ways to get their stories across. So I do think that it's, at a while, if you'd have asked me 5 years ago about journalism and how we were going to cover politics and the legacy of the Troubles, which I have spent a great deal of my time doing, I'd have said it'll probably last till I see my days out and I retire, but after that, there's no future. Now, if you ask me, I have a completely different attitude. I think there's a real future for local journalism. We're just going to have to change the way that we target our audience, the way we reach our audience. The biggest mistake that the media made was giving away content for free. And I think that we've all realised that. Everything has to be paid for now. And you cannot allow people... My biggest laugh is when I tweet a story, people go, I can't read that, it's behind a paywall. I go, do you go into Tesco with a trolley and walk around and fill it full of stuff and walk out the door? Well, no, you don't. You pay for everything that you use. You'll pay for that as well. It's not a hobby, it's my job. And before that, I remember actually saying, did you used to just shoplift newspapers? Is that what you did? I mean, why do you think that this is free? It's just not free. I suppose the early days, I went to do my journalist course, I think it was about 90, at that stage it was 98, it was about 99 when I went to my workplace, and about 2000 before I had a job. People might think that that was sort of peacetime reporting, but it was far from peacetime reporting. I mean, we'd got a peace process, but there was still a great deal of conflict on the streets. And I would say the sort of war, if you like, was much easier solved than the sectarian conflict, which existed because, remember then we went straight into the marching season, the Holy Cross dispute, all of those things. And right up until just probably about, 7 years ago, I was still standing at riots every summer, covering riots at parades. I have a scar in my mouth to prove it. Where I was hit by a bit of slate standing in Ardoyne. The next year, the Irish News, the editor can answer for himself, but the next year they said they'd give us safety equipment and they gave me a helmet. And I remember going to Ardoyne and there was one of the mutual assistance officers from Leeds. And he says, daughter, let me have a look at that. And he took it off me and he says, I wouldn't let my child out of the house on a skateboard, nothing, never mind stand in the middle of a riot. And I went back down to the office and told him all that. But I survived that year with my skateboard and helmet.
Alison, thank you. Noel, what about you in terms of the Irish News, in terms of wider society? Do you think that social media would have scuppered the deal? Would there have been so much comment and commentary that went along that we just didn't have back then?
I suppose I would start off by saying that we've already had all the best bits tonight. If we're talking about, and I would like to compliment Alison on her efforts to make the digital first process sound interesting, because it's not quite at the level where we used to be. I would probably also mention that famous night in Ardoyne. She was specifically told, don't go up and stand too close to the guys on the roof who were throwing the slates. He did throw it a hell of a distance, though.
No, he wasn't throwing it at me. He was clearly throwing it at the police officer halfway down the road. He was just a very bad shot. That's all I'm going to say.
I hope you're not victim shaming there, Noel.
But I do think that in 25 years' time, it's not likely we'll have a seminar to look back on the great days of TweetDeck, focus groups and content management systems. Journalism has moved on. These things have to be done. We're moving into a new era, but it will be very different. It's a long way from the heady days of 1998 when everybody was setting the agenda and was there. And there was a lot going on at that time. I mean, I think Ben is quite right to question his own paper stance. It's quite a brave thing to do at the time. But I would also say that the editor, his predecessor, Jeff Martin, was very courageous at the time, and his link with David Trimble was kind of crucial on the unionist side. We had our moments in the Irish News as well, and we somehow managed to come through it all. And it's great to see so many people along here tonight who are still able to speak about it and remember so fondly everything that happened at the time. But we're moving into a slightly cold new era. It's going to be more focused. It's going to be different. But we need to survive. We've had to reinvent in the past, and we'll do so again.
I mean, we had those comments from Media House at the beginning of April. The chief executive saying that he was given it 10 years, that there wouldn't be print newspapers in 10 years. Do you agree with that? Do you think everything will have gone digital by then?
Well, I think Alison has to agree with him because he's her boss. But I think he specifically said that the Monday to Friday papers were likely to go.
Sundays,
that Saturdays, the whole weekend side of things, and the Sundays would still endure. And I think he may well be right in some areas. Certainly, I think he was predicting that for his own group. Things are tough for daily newspapers right across the board. I'd like to think that our paper will still be producing a newspaper every day for a long time to come, but it'll be different. The work that the journalists do will be different. It's more pressurised, I think, than it's ever been. And that's not just an elderly editor who's bemused by new technology trying to get his head around it all. It gets a little bit tougher every year, not just for people doing the job that I'm doing, but for younger people trying to come into the industry. It's extremely tough, which makes it so important to look back on great periods like 1998.
Yeah, and have that reflection. Freya, somebody had mentioned earlier on about how you keep that communication, how the journalists of today, because it's difficult to control the narrative because so many political parties are kind of going through Twitter and their social media platforms. They're getting their videos out themselves. There's less opportunities or fewer opportunities to do those interviews. They're trying to control very closely what is being said. Do you find, though, that social media helps you with your journalism? Alison sort of touched on that, because actually it's a great source of stories as well for journalists of today.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like most things, it has its good points and its bad points. And I'm old enough to remember a world in journalism before there was social media, when we didn't have the constant deadlines and we didn't have that interaction, that immediate interaction with political parties, for example, but also just with the public, with your readers. And again, that has good points and bad points. I mean, sometimes it can make it much more challenging to operate. And one of the things that I've noticed, even in the last couple of years, is that people are much more quick to give feedback on Twitter and much more quick to give negative feedback on Twitter. And very often about stories that you look at the tweet that they're sending and you think, you haven't read this at all. You know, you're just firing off sort of whatever the opinion is about this. So that's a very different landscape to operate in. I mean, in terms of the day-to-day practicalities of it, again, it can have its good points in terms of if you need to get a statement, it's there quickly. You know, you can look up on Twitter, and if something has happened, you can see what all the political leaders are saying in reaction. You can fire that out very quickly, and in part that helps in this newer landscape where your deadlines are immediate. Again, I'm old enough to, and I started out in weeklies, and on our deadlines where we had a paper on a Tuesday and we had a paper on a Friday. So if something happened on a Wednesday morning, you could go back to the office, you could think about it, you could take your time writing it up, you could decide what you were going to say, you can think, I'm going to phone this other person, I'm going to go out to this. I mean, none of that gets done today. You're just having to react. And again, this seems to be my theme. There are good points and bad points. You know, you're not holding politicians to account if you're simply repeating what Jeffrey Donaldson or Colin Eastwood or Michelle O'Neill has said on Twitter about what has just happened. But at the same time, if you have to get a story up online now or 5 minutes ago, then that's what you're forced to do. So how do you operate then in that new environment? I mean, I think actually what you need to do is you need to stick to those tried and trusted principles of journalism. You actually need to really try not to get your stories from social media. You need to get them from your contacts. You need to get them from going out to stories, to events, to things that are happening, to building up those contacts, to talking to people, and just going back to what I always think of those kind of building blocks of journalism. What is the story? What's happening here? What do people need to know? What do we need to tell them? And try and build that up as much as you can yourself, because everybody who contacts you on Twitter, or who puts a statement out on Twitter, they're trying to tell you something. You really need to get what they don't want to tell you, or the bit that you think that you need to hear, not necessarily what they want to tell you. So for me, I think whatever the medium is, whatever way that you're putting this out, whether this is, as Alison says, through Twitter or podcasts or online, or whatever the format is, or in good old print newspapers, which we still do every day, and I hope we will continue to do for a long, long time. But you're sticking to that principle again of, what's the story? What do I need to do to get that out there?
I think what Freya's saying too is it's the story behind the story now. So we had to make ourselves a point of difference to get people to buy newspapers or to subscribe to a website. So the BBC, they have massive amount of staff. They're breaking the breaking news. So very rarely you're not going to sell a paper on the basis of that. It's yesterday's news by the time the paper's printed. So you have to go behind the story. You have to find something else. You have to find a different angle to it. You have to find someone else you can interview, or you have to be the person that explains and analyses that story to people so that they can understand it. So, our job, I don't think, is as newspaper journalists, albeit we're now online journalists, is not breaking stories. I mean, when I first started, working for a media house because they're digital first, the first thing they said is, if it's on the BBC website, we're not interested in it. And I'm not interested particularly in it either. I'm interested in reading it, but reporting it, I want to get out there, and I still am on the street. I do crime and security journalists. The people who I speak to, you know, they're not that keen on phones for a start. They're convinced everyone's bugging them. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. So my job mainly still involves dealing with the public, and that's the reason why I became a journalist, 'cause that's the part I love.
Yeah, but it's different though, because I'm thinking, Alison, about a court case recently, and you're kind of tweeting the whole way along. You're tweeting from the proceedings. You know, that's how people are kind of digesting. So there is a different skill involved in that. That's different from the days where you would have gone, taken your notes, gone back and written up your story.
Tara,
so it
you
has
would know,
changed.
Tara, you would know you weren't even allowed to take your phone out in the court. I remember judges shouting from the dock because someone actually lifted their phone to check it. You weren't even allowed to look at your phone in the court. And now people are sitting with laptops live tweeting during a court case. It is a completely different world compared to when we started.
I'm just aware of the time. Anybody on the floor that wants to bring up some points on the social media side of things? Oh, there's one at the back there.
Thanks. Tara, I'm not too sure if I'm the only old cop in the audience, but not so much about social media. I just want to say a couple of things with me. Stephen White's my name.
Yes.
Thank you for tonight. And I want to say thank you to all the journalists who have been so understanding of what the role of a police officer was. Like journalists, we had to be accurate in what we were saying. We had to be circumspect. And I think we had to respect each other, that we had different jobs to do. But I was very touched by Corky's comment about the young boy. It brought tears to my eyes. I think at my age now, tears come very easy. But there are a couple of people in this room that I particularly want to mention. Wendy and Seamus, you may not remember, but my very first media interview was in Good Morning Ulster. And there was a massive road traffic accident on the West Link because I'd just been released from the Chief Constable's office. I'd worked with Hugh Annesley for 3 years, and during all that momentous time, if we had time, I could tell you lots of stories about Mo Molam, Peter Manos, and all the stuff that was going on. But I just want to finish by saying a couple of words, if I may. One of the people who I greatly admired, who's no longer with us, is Liam Clark. And Liam was one of the people that in the police circles was highly respected because of his integrity and understanding. And I have personal reasons to believe in that. Another one was, I'm sure some of the older heads will remember here, Bill McGuckin, who was the press officer in the RUC headquarters at the time. And he and I travelled with Hugh Annesley, who was the chief at the time, to Greysteel, and I remember swapping over in the back of the police car, going to that horrible scene. I was giving him the briefing about terrorism and the threat and all that, and then Bill was talking about the media lines to take, lines against inquiry and so on. But that's really all I want to say. I could take a lot longer, but I feel indebted to many of you within the media during my career and since, and I really enjoyed this evening, and I hope we have more opportunities to exchange what are the personal insights, because it's the emotional side, I think, that many of us need to perhaps expunge a little bit. But thank you again for this evening. Thank you.
Stephen, thank you. Another one just down here, just in front of Stephen there.
Paul McErlane. I was John Allardyce's spin doctor in 1995, 6, 7, etc. And I suppose what I wanted to say, and there are a few others here, David's here, Connell's not here, I don't think. Sinn Féin had an army of press officers at that time. But, you know, there were 3 things that struck that maybe I can say that you journalists can't say. The thoroughness. I mean, I remember regularly going out into that hut and being asked by Martina or Billy or a number of the other journalists saying, is this right? Because we would go out and give our version of what was going on inside the talks. Then the unionists would do the same. Then the SDLP would do the same. Then Sinn Féin would do the same. And then, so Joe and Alistair and the government, the NIO team were pretty aligned. But there wasn't an alignment amongst the political parties about what was going on inside. And I think to be able to disseminate and triangulate all of that information and take a thorough, to be very thorough about it, and then be very responsible about it was, you know, a great accolade to all the journalists here. And Derek, I thought, spoke wonderfully earlier on, and nobody carried, and in my view, Derek and a few of the older journalists were very, very kind to some of the younger journalists who came into that hut, because they carried the responsibility. They'd gone through the 70s, they'd gone through the 80s, and they carried the weight of all of that tragedy. And there was such a responsibility. I mean, Derek in particular wore that very visibly and wore it very carefully, I suppose, on his shoulders. But you could see it. So after those 2 years, you know, that thoroughness, that responsibility, then to actually report it, and that's the third thing I want to say, the thoroughness, the responsibility, and then in the end, the fairness of the way it was reported. I mean, I'd have a chat with you afterwards about the newsletter, but, you know, I think those three characteristics were what made a good agreement and a well-reported agreement and a well-reported talks process through. And I think, to be honest, and I'm a PR consultant now, you know, we deal with the journalists on a very regular basis, and that is still the case. And I'll just say this for the crack, apart from the Nolan programme.
Just realise that we're pretty much out of time, but I do want to just take a final thought from each of you on, you know, what is the future, what happens next, Ben?
Okay, the first thing I'd say is I think that newspapers have never been more exciting. It's unbelievable what you can get in a weekend paper particularly, and what you can get online, and video clips, and Twitter as a source of information. A source of abuse is the big, big problem. I've had plenty of abuse. I'm not worried about that. But I can take it, but others can't, and it's very, very serious. And I think that it's really, really exciting. And the sneering about some of the modern stuff, Wikipedia, people sneer at Wikipedia as if they're the Encyclopedia Britannica themselves. Wikipedia is a thing of genius. It's a thing, you have to treat it skeptically. It's a thing of the most incredible genius of where we don't know things are going. So I'm very, very bullish about the future of the media. I think Alison's absolutely right that young people think this is for free. And I think we gave too much away for free. I think the newsletter we still do, and you know, it'll trundle on. Papers are in decline. They'll still be around in 10 years. There'll be fewer of them, and it's going to get more and more exciting.
Ben, thanks very much. Alison?
I do think, I mean, it took a while to realise that we did have to really adapt how we were working and how we were going to work. Some of us were still stuck in that rut and insisting. And, you know, the people who buy papers every day, my mother and father, you know, for instance, who buy the paper every day. My father has dementia and reads a day essay to my mother 10 times each day. But you know, we have to find a way once those, yeah, no, it's certainly not. You would know that would be the arch news. But once those people, and God bless them, they'll not be around forever. We have to find a way to attract younger, newer audiences. And you know, my children wouldn't buy a newspaper even though their mother's a journalist. And will I just say that yesterday when I was at Queen's, and I would say you have meetings in all sorts of strange places. This happened in the toilet. These young women here are young media students from Queen's, and I have never met more enthusiastic young women in my life, and they're the future of journalism, and it's in safe hands if it's in the hands of these young women here.
Great to have you here tonight. Great to have you. Noel?
I think Alison's quite right. There is a great future.
Don't forget your mic.
There is a great future for journalism. There are fantastic opportunities. There's always a crisis around the corner, but you know, you have to be prepared to cope with that. And in terms of, you know, trying to remember where you came from, I was asked where I started off, and it was with The Guardian and The Observer, but it was the Antrim Guardian and the Ballymena Observer, and it didn't do me any harm.
Noel, thanks a million. Final word to you, Freya.
For me, it comes down to trust. And if we're talking about the future of journalism, the one thing that we have to hold on to is trust, and the way in which the public and our readers and viewers trust us. And we've heard so many wonderful things tonight about the achievements of certainly the generation of journalists that went before me, and some of them I've been privileged to work with and to know, and some of the points that we've talked about fairness and integrity, and about trying to get to the truth, and about, you know, the effort that they put into the jobs and into their jobs, and just you know, keeping everybody informed and at what was such a really, really crucial time. And that was all about trust, and you have to have that relationship with readers. And if we're going to face some of these challenges ahead, not least in terms of how we get people to either continue to buy newspapers or how to pay for journalism online, then trust has to be at the heart of it. And I think if we stick to that and follow those principles, I think we'll be all right.
Wise words. Thanks very much. Thanks to all of you. That's it. Please stay around. We'll be out in the bar area for the next hour or so. Please do join us and continue the conversation. Thanks a million for coming tonight.